In the terrarium hobby, we all make mistakes no matter what. But some of these mistakes are so common and so simple to avoid that they end up causing way more damage than they ever should. Whether you're building your first small planted enclosure, or you've got a whole shelf of bioactive vivariums going, the same handful of errors keep showing up again and again, and most of them come from good intentions rather than laziness. Today, I'll be sharing with you 11 terrarium mistakes that I see over and over again. And by the end of this video, you'll know exactly how to avoid the most common mistakes in the hobby and set yourself up for a terrarium that actually thrives instead of slowly falling apart behind the glass while you wonder what went wrong. The first mistake is skipping a proper drainage layer. So many beginners just fill their enclosure straight up with substrate and call it done, not realizing that excess water has nowhere to go. Without somewhere for that water to drain to, your substrate stays waterlogged, and waterlogged substrate is basically an open invitation for anaerobic bacteria, root rot, and that unmistakable swampy smell that tells you something has gone wrong. A drainage layer, usually made of something like leca, lava rock, or a simple false bottom, gives excess water somewhere to sit below the root zone instead of soaking directly into your substrate. It also helps prevent that water from stagnating right where your plants and cleanup crew are trying to live. I always recommend separating your drainage layer from your substrate with a barrier like mesh or landscape fabric so the two don't mix together over time. Because once they mix, you basically have to tear the whole build down and start over. A good rule of thumb is to make your drainage layer roughly proportional to the overall height of your enclosure. So a tall vivarium might need a couple inches of leca, while a shorter, shallower build can get away with less. Some keepers also add an airlift tube or a drainage spout at the bottom, so excess water can actually be pulled out or checked on, rather than just sitting invisibly beneath the substrate forever. It sounds like a small, boring detail compared to picking out plants and decor, but the drainage layer is genuinely the foundation. Everything else in the build depends on, and skipping it is one of those mistakes you don't notice until weeks later when everything starts smelling wrong. The second mistake is using the wrong substrate entirely. This is one of those mistakes that seems harmless at first, but causes problems for months afterward. A lot of people just grab whatever bag of soil or sand is cheapest without checking if it's actually appropriate for a closed, humid environment. Regular potting soil often contains added fertilizers, pesticides, or perlite that were never meant to sit in a sealed, moist enclosure, and those additives can leach into the environment and harm sensitive animals. On the flip side, using something too sandy or too dry for a humidity-loving species is going to leave your terrarium constantly fighting against itself. The substrate you choose should match both the plants and the animals you're keeping, whether that means a bioactive mix with organic material for a tropical setup, or something closer to a desert blend for arid species. Get this wrong, and you're basically building your terrarium on a foundation that works against you. It's also worth mentioning that substrate depth matters just as much as substrate type. A shallow layer might look fine visually, but won't give burrowing species or plant root systems enough room to actually establish themselves, while an overly deep layer in the wrong setup can trap moisture down at the bottom, where it never gets the chance to dry out or aerate properly. Mixing your own substrate blend, combining things like cocoa fiber, sphagnum moss, orchid bark, and a bit of sand or charcoal depending on the species, usually gives far better long-term results than grabbing a single pre-mixed bag and hoping it works for everything you're planning to keep. The third mistake is misting or watering way too often. This is probably the terrarium equivalent of overfeeding fish. Everybody knows not to do it, and yet almost everybody does it anyway, especially in the first few weeks after setting up a new build. People see a tropical terrarium and assume it needs to be soaked constantly to stay humid, but that's simply not true. Overwatering leads to standing water, mold blooms, fungus gnats, and root rot in your plants. It also throws off the humidity cycle your terrarium should naturally go through, where things dry out slightly between mistings before humidity rises again. A terrarium that never gets the chance to dry even a little bit is not a healthy one, no matter how good it looks right after you spray it down. Instead of misting on a fixed schedule out of habit, you should be checking the actual substrate moisture and adjusting based on what the enclosure needs, not what feels satisfying to do. A cheap moisture meter, or even just pressing a finger an inch into the substrate, can tell you far more than a calendar reminder ever will. It also helps to think about where the water actually needs to go. Misting the glass and the top of the leaf litter looks impressive, but does very little for root systems buried underneath, while a slower, deeper watering every few days often keeps humidity more stable than several light mistings spread throughout the day. Automatic misting systems can be great tools, but plenty of people set them to run far more often than the enclosure actually needs, simply because it's convenient to leave running rather than dialed in properly. The fourth mistake is poor or non-existent ventilation. A lot of people seal their terrariums up completely, thinking that trapping in humidity is always a good thing. But airflow matters just as much as moisture does. And treating a terrarium like a sealed jar rather than a living system is one of the fastest ways to turn a good build into a problem build. Without any ventilation, stagnant air builds up, mold spreads across the glass and substrate, and you end up with a musty, oxygen-poor environment that stresses both plants and animals. This is especially dangerous in fully enclosed glass builds, where condensation just keeps recycling the same trapped air over and over. The fix isn't complicated. You want some form of cross-ventilation, whether that's mesh panels, vents built into the lid, or simply cracking the top slightly. Good airflow actually helps maintain healthier humidity levels long-term, because it prevents the kind of stagnant, overly wet conditions that cause mold in the first place. A terrarium is supposed to breathe a little, not sit sealed like a jar of pickles. It also matters where that ventilation is placed. Vents positioned only near the bottom or only near the top can create dead air pockets in the middle of the enclosure. So cross-ventilation, meaning airflow that moves horizontally through the space as well as vertically, tends to give far more even results. If you're noticing persistent condensation that never clears, glass that stays fogged all day, or a musty smell whenever you open the lid, those are usually signs that your ventilation setup needs adjusting long before mold becomes a visible problem. Mistake number 5 is not researching your species' actual requirements before buying anything. This sounds obvious, but it's shocking how many people buy an animal or a plant first and figure out the setup afterward, usually because something looked appealing in a store display, and the decision got made before any homework happened. Every species has its own specific needs for temperature, humidity, lighting, and enclosure size, and those needs don't magically adjust to whatever setup you already have sitting around. A species that needs a significant temperature drop at night is not going to thrive in an enclosure that stays the exact same temperature 24 hours a day. A plant that needs bright, indirect light is going to slowly decline in a dim, low-light build, no matter how much you water it. Before you bring anything home, you should already know the humidity range, temperature range, enclosure size, and lighting needs for that specific species. Not a rough guess based on what worked for something similar. Skipping this step is how people end up with sick animals and dead plants within the first month. It also matters where that information comes from. A lot of beginners rely entirely on whatever the pet store employee tells them, or worse, whatever generic care sheet shows up first in a search, without cross-checking it against multiple sources or an actual species-specific keeper community. Requirements can vary meaningfully even between closely related species, so a care sheet written broadly for an entire genus is not always going to be accurate, down to the specific animal or plant you're bringing home. Spending an extra hour researching before you buy anything is almost always cheaper, in money and in stress, than trying to fix a mismatched setup after the fact. The 6th mistake is using decorations and hardscape that aren't actually terrarium safe. Just like fake plastic plants can leach chemicals into an aquarium, A lot of decor marketed for terrariums, or even collected from outside, can introduce toxins, sharp edges, or unwanted pests into your enclosure. Driftwood, rocks, and bark collected from your backyard might look great, but they can carry pesticides, mold spores, mites, or other contaminants depending on where they came from, especially if the area has ever been treated with lawn chemicals or sits near a road where runoff collects. Painted or dyed decorations can also slowly release chemicals once they're exposed to consistent humidity. If you're using anything sourced outside, it needs to be properly cleaned and, in many cases, baked or boiled to kill off anything hitching a ride. And if you're buying decor from a store, make sure it's actually rated safe for enclosed, humid environments, rather than just something that happens to look nice on a shelf. Metals are a particularly sneaky problem here, since certain metal-based decorations or dyed elements can slowly corrode or leach in a consistently humid enclosure, even though they looked completely inert, sitting on a dry store shelf. The same caution applies to substrate additives like colored gravel or scented items, both of which are far more common in general terrarium and craft sections than people realize, and neither of which belongs anywhere near a living enclosure. Mistake 7 is not accounting for a bioactive cleanup crew properly, or skipping one entirely when your setup actually needs it. A lot of people build a beautiful bioactive terrarium, add plants, add substrate, and then completely forget that the whole system depends on isopods, springtails, or other detritivores to break down waste and prevent mold and bacteria from taking over, treating the cleanup crew as an optional decorative add-on rather than a core functional part of the enclosure. Without a cleanup crew, waste just sits there and builds up, which throws off the entire balance of the enclosure. On the other end, some people add a cleanup crew, but then either overfeed them or underfeed the main occupants, leaving nothing behind for the isopods and springtails to actually clean up. A healthy bioactive terrarium is a balance between what your main animal produces as waste and what your cleanup crew can realistically process. Get that balance wrong in either direction, and the whole ecosystem starts working against itself instead of for you. It also takes time for a cleanup crew to establish a healthy population, so adding a tiny handful of isopods to a large enclosure and expecting them to immediately keep up with waste output is unrealistic. Most keepers seed a new bioactive terrarium with a larger starter culture and give it several weeks to a couple months to build up before introducing the main animal, letting the cleanup crew get established in an environment that isn't yet under pressure from a hungry occupant. The 8th mistake is inconsistent or completely wrong lighting. This one especially applies to planted terrariums, but it matters for animal enclosures too, since many reptiles and amphibians need specific UVB output to stay healthy long term. People often either skip proper lighting altogether, relying on ambient room light that isn't nearly strong enough, or they install something completely mismatched to what their terrarium actually needs. Plants that need higher light intensity will slowly stretch, fade, and die under weak lighting, while lighting that's too intense for shade-loving species can scorch leaves and dry out microhabitats meant to stay cool and damp. For any species requiring UVB, using the wrong bulb, an expired bulb, or placing it too far from the basking area can lead to serious long-term health problems that don't show up right away. Just like with an aquarium, matching the right light type and intensity to your specific terrarium setup makes the difference between everything thriving and everything slowly struggling without you noticing until it's too late. It's also worth paying attention to how long your lights stay on each day, not just how strong they are. A consistent photo period, generally somewhere around 10 to 12 hours for most tropical setups, helps plants and animals maintain a stable day-night rhythm, while an inconsistent schedule where lights come on and off at random times throughout the week can create ongoing low-level stress, even if every other parameter looks correct on paper. A simple outlet timer solves this problem completely and costs next to nothing. Mistake number 9 is ignoring temperature and humidity gradients. A lot of people set their terrarium to one single temperature and one single humidity level, and assume that's good enough. but most species actually need a range of conditions to choose from throughout the enclosure. Without a proper gradient, animals can't thermoregulate or move to a more comfortable microclimate when they need to, which causes chronic stress even if the average conditions look fine on paper. The same goes for humidity. A terrarium that's uniformly damp everywhere doesn't give animals, or even certain plants, the drier basking spots or more humid hides they need throughout the day. Using multiple thermometers and hygrometers placed in different zones of the enclosure rather than trusting a single reading near the front glass is the only real way to know what's actually happening across the whole terrarium. It's surprisingly common for the reading near the front door of an enclosure to be several degrees off from a hide tucked into the back corner, and that gap is exactly the kind of thing a single thermometer near the glass will never reveal. Building in deliberate variation, a warmer basking area on one side, a cooler and more humid retreat on the other, taller plants or bark providing shaded pockets throughout, gives whatever you're keeping the ability to actually choose its own comfort, rather than being stuck with whatever average condition you decided to set the whole enclosure to. The 10th mistake is overcrowding the enclosure, whether that's too many animals, too many plants, or simply not leaving enough usable space for anything to establish itself properly. It's tempting to fill every inch of a new terrarium because a fully packed build looks impressive right after setup, but plants need room to grow into their mature size, and animals need enough territory to feel secure rather than constantly stressed by close contact. Overcrowding also accelerates waste buildup, since more waste is being produced in the same amount of space without a proportional increase in what your substrate and cleanup crew can actually process. This is especially common with terrestrial invertebrates and small reptiles, where people assume more individuals automatically means a more lively, interesting display. In reality, an overcrowded terrarium usually ends up looking worse over time as plants get outcompeted for light and space, and animals show more stress-related behavior than they would in a properly sized setup. Overcrowding also makes every other mistake on this list harder to manage, since a packed enclosure has less airflow between plants, less visible substrate to monitor for mold, and less room to physically reach in and make adjustments without disturbing everything else. A good general approach is to plan your stocking and planting density around the mature size of everything you're adding, not the size it is on the day you bring it home, which means most healthy terrariums actually look a little sparse for the first several weeks before growth fills things in naturally. The 11th and final mistake is not quarantining new plants or animals before introducing them to an established terrarium. This is exactly like adding sick fish straight into a healthy aquarium, except in a terrarium, the risk often comes from pests and pathogens hiding in soil or on foliage rather than something you can see swimming around. New plants can carry mites, fungus gnat larvae, or mold spores buried in their root systems, and new animals can bring in parasites or illnesses that haven't shown symptoms yet. Skipping quarantine means any hidden problem gets introduced directly into an ecosystem you've spent weeks or months carefully balancing, and by the time symptoms show up, it can already be spreading through your entire setup. A simple quarantine period, keeping new additions separate and observing them closely before introducing them to the main terrarium, is one of the easiest ways to protect everything you've already built. For plants, that usually means a thorough rinse of the root system, a close inspection of the undersides of leaves, and sometimes a few weeks in a separate container to watch for pests before it goes anywhere near your established build. For animals, a proper quarantine setup, isolated food and water, close monitoring for appetite and behavior changes, and enough time for any incubating illness to actually show symptoms matters just as much in a terrarium as it does in any other kind of animal keeping. Skipping this one step because you're excited to see everything together in the finished enclosure is how a single hidden problem turns into a terrarium-wide one. Thank you so much for watching. Most of these mistakes aren't the result of anyone being careless. They're the result of habits carried over from other hobbies or assumptions that sound reasonable until you actually watch what happens inside a closed living system over several months. Fixing even a couple of these will make a noticeable difference in how your terrarium looks and functions long-term. If you want to see more videos just like these, make sure to subscribe down below. If you want to know my top setup mistakes to avoid in a bioactive vivarium specifically, click the video on screen.